Marcus Rivera stared at the eviction notice taped to his apartment door, the red letters seeming to blur as exhaustion clouded his vision. 30 days. That's all the time he had left before he and his 8-year-old daughter Sofia would be homeless again. The part-time custodial job at the community center barely covered groceries, let alone the rent on their cramped studio apartment in the rough part of downtown Phoenix. Behind him, Sofia sat quietly at their makeshift kitchen table, methodically arranging her few colored pencils in perfect rows, while humming a melody only she could hear. The autism diagnosis had come 3 years ago, shortly after her mother Elena had walked out, unable to cope with what she called a broken child and a broken man. Since then, it had been just the two of them against a world that seemed determined to prove they didn't belong anywhere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast harsh shadows through the blinds of their studio apartment as Marcus folded the eviction notice and placed it in the drawer with the other bills he couldn't afford to pay. Sofia continued her ritual with the colored pencils, lining them up by height, then by color intensity, then starting the process over again. It was one of her routines that brought order to a world that often felt chaotic and overwhelming for her developing mind. Marcus had learned to find beauty in these moments of structure that Sofia created for herself. Where others saw obsessive behavior or developmental delays, he saw a brilliant mind that processed the world differently. A child who found patterns and meaning in places most people never thought to look. Her drawings covered every available wall space in their small apartment, intricate geometric patterns mixed with swirling abstractions that seemed to capture emotions he couldn't put into words. The community center where Marcus worked nights had become Sofia's second home. While he cleaned offices and classrooms, she would sit in the art room, drawing by the light of the hallway fixtures, creating worlds on paper that made more sense to her than the one outside. Mrs. Chen, the elderly art teacher who sometimes stayed late, had mentioned more than once that Sofia had unusual talent, an intuitive understanding of color and composition that couldn't be taught. But talent didn't pay rent or put food on the table. Marcus's days were a careful balance of job searching, navigating social services appointments, and ensuring Sofia had the stability and routine she needed to thrive. The rejection letters from potential employers had become routine. His conviction from 8 years ago, a mistake made in desperation when Elena was pregnant and he was unemployed, followed him to every interview despite his clean record since then. Sofia's needs required specialized attention that most schools couldn't provide. The public school had suggested she might be better served in a special education program across town, but Marcus had seen those classrooms, had watched children who were different being warehoused rather than educated. He'd chosen to homeschool her instead, using library books and free online resources, watching her excel in mathematics and art while struggling with verbal communication and social interaction. Their apartment was a testament to making do with less. The furniture came from thrift stores and garage sales, carefully chosen pieces that Sofia had helped select based on her comfort with their textures and colors. The walls were covered not with expensive artwork, but with Sofia's creations, a gallery of her inner world that transformed their humble space into something that felt like home, despite its impermanence. The eviction notice represented more than just the loss of their housing. It meant disrupting Sofia's carefully constructed sense of safety, forcing her to adapt to new environments and routines when change was already so difficult for her to process. Marcus had seen what happened when Sofia's world became too unstable. The meltdowns, the regression in her communication skills, the way she would withdraw into herself for days at a time. His phone buzzed with a text message from his brother Carlos in Denver, another well-meaning offer to help that came with conditions Marcus couldn't accept. Move to Colorado, let Sofia go to a residential program, get your life together first, and then worry about being a father. The suggestion made his stomach clench with anger and desperation. Carlos meant well, but he couldn't understand that Sofia wasn't a problem to be managed or outsourced to professionals. She was his daughter, and their bond was one of the few things in his life that made sense. The community center job paid $8 an hour for 25 hours a week, barely enough to cover their basic expenses, even with government assistance. Marcus had applied for dozens of better positions, but his background check always ended the conversation. Construction companies, retail chains, office buildings. They all had policies about hiring people with criminal records, regardless of how old the offense was or how much someone's life had changed. Sofia looked up from her pencil arrangement and signed "hungry" in the simple American Sign Language they'd learned together. Her verbal communication came in waves, sometimes flowing freely, and other times locked behind barriers that frustration and overstimulation created. The sign language had become their bridge during the difficult moments, a way to maintain connection when words failed both of them. Marcus opened their nearly empty refrigerator and assembled a lunch from their dwindling supplies. Peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, and water. Sofia ate methodically, taking small bites and chewing carefully, another of her routines that brought predictability to the sensory experience of eating. She had texture sensitivities that made many foods impossible for her to tolerate, which added another layer of complexity to their grocery budget. The afternoon was spent at the public library, where Sofia could access computers for her online learning modules, while Marcus searched job listings and filled out applications. The librarians had become accustomed to their daily presence, offering quiet understanding and occasional help with Sofia's educational needs. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head librarian, had mentioned that the library sometimes hired part-time assistants for evening programs, but the position required passing a more extensive background check that Marcus knew would eliminate him from consideration. Sofia thrived in the library's quiet, organized environment. The consistent lighting, predictable layout, and respect for personal space made it one of the few public places where she felt completely comfortable. She would spend hours in the art book section, studying paintings and drawings with an intensity that amazed the staff. Her ability to focus on visual details and patterns that others missed had led several librarians to comment on her exceptional observational skills. Their walk home took them past the Phoenix Contemporary Art Museum, a building Sofia always insisted on stopping to observe. The architecture fascinated her, the way light played across the glass surfaces and created geometric patterns that shifted throughout the day. Marcus had learned to build extra time into their route for these observation periods, understanding that they were important for Sofia's processing and well-being. The museum's exterior walls sometimes featured community art installations, and Sofia would study each piece with the same intensity she brought to her library research. Marcus had noticed that she seemed to understand something about the emotional content of the artwork that went beyond simple visual appreciation. She would point to specific elements in a painting or sculpture, and then show him through her own drawings how those elements created feelings or told stories. That evening, while Marcus prepared their simple dinner, Sofia sat at her usual spot at the kitchen table, and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Began working on a new drawing. This one was different from her typical geometric patterns. She used blues and grays in flowing, organic shapes that seemed to represent water or wind. In the center of the composition, she placed small figures that looked like they were dancing or celebrating, surrounded by swirls of brighter colors that suggested joy and movement. Marcus watched her work, marveling at the way she could create such emotionally complex art without formal training or expensive materials. Her colored pencils were worn down to stubs, and her paper was the cheap copy paper he bought in bulk from the discount store. But her talent transformed these humble supplies into something that captured feelings he struggled to express in words. The drawing seemed to represent hope in the midst of uncertainty, stability found in motion rather than stillness. As Sofia worked, her humming became more melodic, a sign that she was entering the focused, creative state where her mind felt most at peace. These moments were precious for both of them, reminders that despite their struggles, there was beauty and meaning to be found in their daily life together. After dinner, they walked to the community center for Marcus's shift. Sofia brought her art supplies and settled into her familiar corner of the art room while Marcus began his cleaning routine. The building was mostly empty in the evenings, creating a peaceful environment where Sofia could work on her drawings without the sensory overload that crowded spaces sometimes created for her. Mrs. Chen occasionally stayed late to work on lesson plans, and on those evenings she would sit with Sofia and offer gentle guidance about techniques and materials. The elderly teacher had recognized something special in Sofia's work, a natural understanding of composition and color theory that typically developed only after years of formal training. Marcus cleaned methodically, taking pride in his work even though the pay was inadequate for their needs. He had learned that excellence in small things was one of the few ways he could maintain self-respect in circumstances that often felt degrading and hopeless. Each classroom he cleaned, each floor he mopped, was done with the same attention to detail he brought to caring for Sofia. The quiet of the evening hours gave him time to think and plan. The eviction notice had forced him to consider options he'd been avoiding. There were shelters for families, but the noise and crowding would be traumatic for Sofia. There were relatives who might help temporarily, but their assistance came with judgment and conditions that would ultimately separate him from his daughter. As he worked, Marcus found himself thinking about the artwork Sofia created, the way she seemed to find peace and meaning through her creative expression. He'd read about art therapy programs for children with autism, structured approaches that used creative activities to help with communication and emotional regulation. But those programs required money and insurance coverage they didn't have, resources that remained out of reach despite their potential benefits. Sofia had fallen asleep at her drawing table by the time Marcus finished his cleaning routine. He gently gathered her supplies and helped her to their makeshift sleeping area in the art room storage closet, where they'd arranged blankets and pillows for the nights when staying at the community center felt safer than walking home through their neighborhood's late-night dangers. Lying in the darkness, listening to Sofia's steady breathing, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a different future. A place where Sofia could develop her artistic gifts with proper materials and guidance. A life where their basic needs were secure enough that he could focus on nurturing her talents rather than simply surviving from day to day. A world where being different wasn't seen as being broken, where Sofia's unique way of seeing and interpreting the world was valued rather than merely tolerated. The eviction notice crumpled in his pocket served as a reminder that such dreams required more than hope. They required opportunities that seemed increasingly unlikely to appear, connections that remained beyond their reach, and resources that their current circumstances made impossible to obtain. But as Sofia shifted in her sleep and murmured contentedly, Marcus renewed his commitment to finding a way forward, to creating possibilities where none seemed to exist. The next morning brought new challenges, and the same persistent hope that had carried them through every previous crisis. Marcus woke before dawn, carefully gathering their belongings and preparing Sofia for another day of navigating a world that often seemed designed for people different from themselves. The eviction notice still waited in his pocket, but so did Sofia's latest drawing, a reminder that beauty and meaning could be found even in their most difficult circumstances. 2 weeks later, desperation had sharpened Marcus's focus to a razor's edge. The eviction date loomed just 16 days away, and every lead for better employment had dead-ended at the background check phase. He'd started scanning Craigslist for opportunities that might not require formal applications, looking for cash work or positions with small businesses that might be willing to overlook his past mistakes in exchange for reliable labor. That's when he found the listing that would change everything. Seeking art instructor for private tutoring, child with special needs, discretion required. Generous compensation for right candidate. The posting was sparse on details but included a phone number and an email address. Something about the phrasing suggested the family was dealing with challenges similar to his own. People who understood that conventional solutions didn't work for children who experienced the world differently. Marcus read the listing 3 times before deciding to respond. He crafted an email that was honest about his situation, while emphasizing his experience with Sofia and his understanding of autism spectrum needs. He mentioned Sofia's artistic abilities and his observations about how creative expression helped her communicate and process emotions. He didn't mention his criminal record or their impending homelessness, but he was honest about being a single father who understood the challenges of raising a child with special needs. The response came within hours, faster than any legitimate job inquiry he'd ever received. The message was brief but encouraging, asking him to call a number to discuss the position. The caller ID showed a Phoenix area code, and when Marcus dialed the number that evening after his shift at the community center, he was connected to a woman with a professional but warm voice. "Mr. Rivera, thank you for responding to our listing. I'm Catherine Nakamura, and I represent a family who needs someone very special to work with their son. The child is 8 years old, highly intelligent, but struggles with traditional educational approaches due to autism spectrum characteristics. His parents have seen remarkable results when he's engaged through artistic activities, but they need someone who understands both the creative and therapeutic aspects of that approach." Marcus felt his heart rate increase as Catherine continued. The description could have been written about Sofia, down to the specific age and combination of intellectual gifts with communication challenges. He found himself speaking more freely than he had in any job interview, describing Sofia's routines, her artistic development, and the strategies they'd developed together for managing sensory overload and communication barriers. The family is willing to pay $50 per hour for the right person, Catherine continued, with the expectation of 15 to 20 hours per week initially. They're looking for someone who can provide both structured art instruction and the kind of intuitive support that helps children like this thrive. Does this sound like something you might be qualified for? $50 per hour. Marcus did the quick calculation and felt dizzy. At 20 hours per week, that would be more than he currently made in a month at the community center. It would solve their immediate housing crisis and provide stability he hadn't dared to hope for. But the opportunities seemed too good to be true, and his experience had taught him to be cautious about situations that appeared to offer easy solutions to complex problems. I would be very interested in learning more about the position, Marcus replied carefully. Could you tell me more about the family and their expectations? Catherine's voice became slightly more guarded. The family values privacy highly. The father is a prominent businessman, and they've had difficulties with previous tutors who didn't understand the boundaries required when working with high-profile clients. They would need you to sign confidentiality agreements and commit to discretion about the family's personal circumstances. The mention of confidentiality agreements and high-profile clients triggered Marcus's wariness. His past experience with people who had money and power hadn't been positive. The wealthy family who had pressed charges against him 8 years ago had used their resources to ensure he faced the maximum penalties for a mistake that desperation had driven him to make. But $50 per hour represented a lifeline he couldn't afford to ignore. I understand the need for privacy, Marcus said. I'm very discreet by nature, and I would have no reason to discuss a client family's personal business with anyone else. When might it be possible to meet and discuss the specifics? Catherine scheduled an interview for the following afternoon at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, an upscale suburb north of Phoenix where Marcus rarely had reason to visit. The drive would require most of his remaining gas money, but the potential payoff justified the risk. He arranged for Mrs. Chen to stay with Sofia at the community center during his absence, explaining that he had a job interview that could significantly improve their circumstances. The coffee shop was exactly what Marcus had expected from a Scottsdale location. Polished concrete floors, exposed brick walls, and menu prices that would consume his food budget for a week. He arrived 15 minutes early and ordered a small black coffee, finding a quiet table where he could observe other customers while waiting for Catherine to arrive. She was easy to identify when she entered. Professional attire, confident posture, and the kind of subtle but expensive accessories that suggested significant financial resources. Catherine ordered an elaborate drink and joined Marcus at his table, her expression friendly but evaluative. Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Rivera. I've done some preliminary research, and I believe you might be exactly what this family needs. Before we proceed, I need to ask about your background. Have you ever been arrested or convicted of any crimes? Marcus had prepared for this question, but hearing it still made his stomach tighten. Yes, I have a conviction from 8 years ago. It was a non-violent property crime that occurred during a very difficult period in my life. I've had no legal troubles since then, and I understand that this history might disqualify me from consideration. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Actually, that's not necessarily disqualifying for this position. The family has had problems with tutors who seemed perfect on paper but lacked the real-world experience that comes from facing genuine hardship. They're more interested in someone who understands struggle and has found ways to create stability despite challenging circumstances. This response was so unexpected that Marcus wasn't sure how to process it. In his experience, a criminal record was an immediate disqualifier for any position involving children, especially with wealthy families who had resources to hire people with clean backgrounds. Catherine's suggestion that his history might actually be an advantage seemed too good to be true. Could you tell me more about the child and what the family is hoping to accomplish through art instruction? Marcus asked. Catherine's expression warmed as she began describing the boy. His name is David, and he's remarkably bright but struggles with verbal communication and social interaction. He has intense interests in specific subjects and can become overwhelmed in traditional educational settings. His parents have noticed that he communicates more freely when he's engaged in artistic activities, and they've seen significant improvements in his overall functioning when he has regular access to creative expression. The description resonated deeply with Marcus's experience with Sofia. The pattern of intellectual gifts combined with communication challenges, the importance of creative outlets for emotional regulation, the need for educational approaches that worked with rather than against the child's natural inclinations. He found himself sharing specific strategies he'd developed with Sofia, techniques for creating calm environments and building trust through shared creative activities. Catherine listened intently, occasionally taking notes on her phone. The family has tried several tutors, but none of them seem to understand that David's autism isn't a problem to be solved, but rather a different way of experiencing and processing the world. They need someone who can meet him where he is and help him develop his strengths rather than focusing primarily on his challenges. As their conversation continued, Marcus began to understand that this position might be more than just a job. The family seemed to be looking for someone who could provide David with the kind of understanding and support that Marcus had learned to give Sofia, the recognition that children with autism had unique gifts that could flourish with the right encouragement and environment. If the family decides to move forward, when would the position begin? Marcus asked. Immediately, Catherine replied. They're eager to find the right person, and David has been without consistent instruction for several weeks while they've been searching. Would you be available to start within the next few days? Marcus thought about the eviction notice, their dwindling resources, and Sofia's need for stability. The timing couldn't be more perfect, assuming the position materialized as described, but his experience had taught him to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too convenient or generous. I would be very interested in moving forward, he said carefully. What would be the next steps in the process? Catherine smiled and gathered her belongings. I'll present your information to the family this evening. Assuming they approve, which I expect they will, we'll arrange a trial session with David later this week. The family prefers to see how a potential tutor interacts with their son before making final decisions. Does that sound acceptable? Marcus agreed to the trial session, exchanging contact information and confirming his availability for the remainder of the week. As Catherine left, he remained at the coffee shop for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The position seemed almost too perfectly suited to his background and Sofia's needs, but the compensation and timing suggested it might be the breakthrough they desperately required. Driving back toward Phoenix, Marcus allowed himself to imagine what life might look like if this opportunity proved genuine. Stable income that would not only cover their basic needs but provide resources for Sofia's artistic development. Work that utilized his understanding of autism rather than seeing it as a liability. The possibility of helping another family navigate challenges similar to their own while creating financial security for his daughter. But beneath his cautious optimism, Marcus remained wary of situations that appeared too good to be true. His past experience had taught him that wealthy families could be generous when it served their purposes, but ruthless when their interests were threatened. The confidentiality requirements and emphasis on discretion suggested complications that might not be immediately apparent. When he returned to the community center, Sofia was in her usual spot in the art room, working on a new drawing that incorporated architectural elements similar to those they'd observed at the museum. Her focus and contentment reminded him why this opportunity mattered so much. Not just for their immediate financial needs, but for the possibility of building a life where Sofia's gifts could flourish and where their daily existence wasn't dominated by survival concerns. That evening, as they prepared for sleep in their makeshift arrangement at the community center, Marcus shared carefully edited details about his interview. He explained that he might have found work helping another child who experienced the world the way Sofia did, that this could lead to the kind of stability they'd been hoping for. Sofia looked up from her drawing and signed, "Happy," followed by "home," her way of expressing hope that this change might bring them closer to having a permanent place where they belonged. Marcus hugged his daughter and promised that whatever happened, they would face it together, as they always had. The call from Catherine came the next morning, while Marcus was helping Sofia with her mathematics exercises. The family wanted to schedule a trial session for that afternoon, at their home in Paradise Valley, one of Phoenix's most exclusive neighborhoods. Catherine provided detailed directions and emphasized again the importance of discretion and professionalism. Paradise Valley was a world apart from the neighborhoods where Marcus and Sofia had lived. Massive homes on multi-acre lots, perfectly maintained landscaping, and security systems that suggested residents who valued privacy and protection. The address Catherine had provided led to a gated estate that looked more like a private resort than a family residence. Marcus announced himself at the security gate and was directed to park in a circular driveway near the main house. The architecture was southwestern modern, all clean lines and natural materials that complemented rather than competed with the desert landscape. Through large windows, he could see art collections and furnishings that represented more money than he'd ever imagined possessing. Catherine met him at the front door and led him through a home that felt more like a museum than a lived-in space. Everything was perfectly arranged, expensive, and somehow impersonal despite its obvious beauty. They walked through several rooms before reaching what Catherine described as David's study, a space that had been specifically designed for his educational needs. The room was a revelation. Natural lighting from skylights, comfortable furniture in calming colors, and art supplies that Marcus recognized as professional quality. Built-in shelving held books, games, and materials organized in a way that suggested understanding of how children with autism needed their environment structured. This was what learning spaces could look like when money wasn't a constraint, when a child's specific needs could be prioritized over convenience or cost. "David should be here in a few minutes," Catherine explained. His parents wanted to observe the initial interaction from another room, just to see how he responds to you. They've learned that he's very sensitive to adult expectations and performs better when he doesn't feel like he's being evaluated. Marcus understood the wisdom of this approach. Sofia also responded better to new situations when pressure was minimized, when she could explore relationships at her own pace without feeling rushed or judged. He used the time before David's arrival to examine the art supplies and familiarize himself with the room's layout, thinking about how he might create the kind of calm, creative environment that had worked so well with Sofia. When David entered the room, Marcus's first thought was how much the boy resembled Sofia in certain ways. The careful observation of his surroundings, the way he moved with deliberate precision, the intelligent eyes that seemed to take in far more information than most people realized. David was well-dressed in expensive clothing, but his posture and expression suggested the same kind of cautious wariness that Marcus recognized in his own daughter. "Hello, David," Marcus said quietly, remaining seated so he wouldn't loom over the boy. "I'm Marcus. I heard you like to draw, and I brought some things we might work on together if you're interested." David didn't respond verbally, but he moved closer to examine the materials Marcus had brought. Simple supplies compared to what was already available in the room, but chosen specifically for their versatility, and the kind of open-ended creative exploration that worked well with children who thought differently. Marcus began sketching simple geometric shapes on a piece of paper, not directing David's attention, but simply creating something that might spark curiosity. The technique had worked with Sofia countless times, the act of creation drawing her into participation without pressure or expectations. David watched for several minutes before picking up a pencil and adding his own elements to Marcus's drawing. His additions were precise and purposeful, geometric patterns that complemented and extended the original shapes in ways that showed sophisticated understanding of visual relationships. As he worked, his posture relaxed, and his breathing became more even, signs that Marcus recognized as indicators of comfort and engagement. They worked together in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, creating a collaborative piece that incorporated both of their styles and approaches. David's contributions showed the same kind of intuitive understanding of composition and balance that Marcus had observed in Sofia's work, the natural artistic sense that seemed to accompany certain forms of autism spectrum thinking. When Catherine quietly entered the room to check on their progress, David looked up and spoke his first words of the session. "He draws the way I think," he said simply, a statement that captured something profound about the connection that had formed between them through their shared creative activity. Marcus felt a surge of recognition and hope. This was exactly what Sofia had been trying to express through her drawings, the sense that art could serve as a bridge between different ways of experiencing and understanding the world. David's comment suggested that he'd found in Marcus someone who could meet him in that creative space, where communication flowed more naturally. The trial session concluded with David showing Marcus other artwork he'd created, pieces that demonstrated remarkable skill and emotional depth for someone his age. As they talked about his drawings, David's verbal communication became more fluid, his explanations revealing sophisticated thinking about color, composition, and the emotional content of visual art. Catherine walked Marcus to his car after the session, her expression indicating satisfaction with how the interaction had proceeded. The family was very impressed with how quickly David connected with you. They'd like to offer you the position, starting with 15 hours per week at $50 per hour. Would you be able to begin this coming Monday? Standing in the circular driveway of the most expensive home he'd ever entered, Marcus felt the weight of transformation settling around him. This opportunity represented more than just employment. It was the chance to use his understanding of Sofia's needs to help another family, while creating the financial stability that would allow his own daughter to thrive. "Yes," he said simply, "I accept the position." The paperwork and arrangements were handled with the kind of efficiency that significant resources could provide. By Friday, Marcus had signed contracts, completed background checks that somehow didn't disqualify him, and received his first advance payment. The money was enough to pay their back rent, avoid eviction, and stock their apartment with food and supplies for the first time in months. But the most significant change wasn't financial. For the first time since Elena had left, Marcus felt like his experience as Sofia's father was being valued rather than seen as a liability. The skills he'd developed in understanding autism, creating supportive environments, and communicating through creative expression were exactly what this family needed. His background wasn't being overlooked despite his criminal record. It was being recognized as preparation for this specific opportunity. That weekend, as he and Sofia celebrated their new stability with a modest dinner at a restaurant they hadn't been able to afford in months, Marcus reflected on how dramatically their circumstances had shifted. The eviction notice that had seemed like a catastrophe had forced him to take risks that led to opportunities he never would have discovered otherwise. Sofia seemed to sense the change in their situation, her drawings becoming more colorful and optimistic, her humming more frequent and melodic. The stress that had shadowed both of their lives for months was beginning to lift, replaced by the kind of cautious hope that comes when basic needs are finally secure. As they walked home through their neighborhood, Sofia pointed to the evening sky and signed, "Beautiful," her way of acknowledging that their world felt different now, more stable and full of possibility. Marcus squeezed her hand and signed back, "Yes," understanding that they had somehow navigated their way through their darkest period and emerged into something that looked remarkably like the future he'd been afraid to imagine. The following Monday marked the beginning of Marcus's new life as David Nakamura's art instructor, though he quickly learned that the boy's last name was actually Harrison, and that Catherine was not a family member, but rather a highly paid coordinator who managed various aspects of the family's complex life. The deception had been a security measure, a way of screening potential employees without revealing the family's true identity until trust had been established. David's father was James Harrison, CEO of one of Phoenix's largest technology companies, a man whose wealth and influence made privacy a necessity rather than a preference. The family lived with the kind of security concerns that came with significant public visibility, which explained the confidentiality requirements and careful screening process that Marcus had undergone. The revelation of the family's true identity came during Marcus's second week, when James Harrison appeared unexpectedly during one of the art sessions. Marcus recognized him immediately from business news coverage, though seeing him in person revealed the stress and exhaustion that professional photography had concealed. "Mr. Rivera," James said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I wanted to speak with you personally about the work you're doing with my son." Marcus felt a familiar tension in his chest, the defensive wariness that interactions with powerful people always triggered. In his experience, wealthy individuals who wanted to speak personally usually had complaints or demands that would complicate his life in unpredictable ways. But James's expression was not what Marcus had expected. Instead of arrogance or dismissal, he saw something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with desperation, the expression of a father who had been searching for solutions to help his child. "David has been different since you started working with him," James continued. "More communicative, less anxious, more willing to engage with new situations. His mother and I had begun to worry that he might never connect with other people in meaningful ways. What you've accomplished in 2 weeks is remarkable." The conversation that followed was unlike any Marcus had experienced with an employer. James spoke candidly about the challenges of raising a child with autism while managing a high-profile career, the difficulty of finding educational resources that understood David's specific needs, and the frustration of having significant financial resources but struggling to convert them into real help for his son. "Money can buy the best doctors, the most expensive therapies, the finest materials and facilities," James explained. but it can't buy understanding. It can't purchase the kind of intuitive connection that helps a child feel safe and valued. That's something that comes from experience, from genuine empathy, from having faced similar challenges yourself. As James spoke, Marcus began to understand that despite their vastly different economic circumstances, they were both fathers struggling to provide their children with what they needed to thrive. The wealth that seemed to solve every problem actually created new complications, making it difficult to distinguish between people who genuinely cared about David's welfare and those who were motivated by access to the family's resources. "I'd like to discuss expanding your role here," James continued. "David responds to you in ways we haven't seen with other instructors. Would you be open to increasing your hours and perhaps taking on additional responsibilities related to his education and development?" The offer was generous beyond anything Marcus had imagined. 40 hours per week at $50 per hour, plus benefits and resources for professional development. The income would transform not only his and Sofia's immediate circumstances, but provide the kind of long-term security that would allow him to plan for her future in ways he'd never been able to consider. But the offer also represented a level of responsibility that made him nervous. Becoming integral to David's development meant becoming entangled with a family whose lives were far more complex than his own, whose problems might be solved by money, but whose solutions required the kind of discretion and loyalty that could be tested in unexpected ways. "I would be very interested in expanding my role," Marcus replied carefully, "but I should mention that I have a daughter who has similar needs to David's. My arrangements would need to accommodate my responsibilities to her." James's expression shifted to one of genuine interest. "Tell me about your daughter." Marcus found himself sharing Sofia's story, her artistic abilities, her autism diagnosis, their struggles with housing and educational resources. As he spoke, he watched James's expression change from polite attention to active engagement, the response of someone who recognized parallel experiences and challenges. "How old is your daughter?" James asked. 8, the same age as David. "Would she be interested in joining David's art sessions? It might be beneficial for both of them to work with someone their own age who understands their perspective." The suggestion was so unexpected that Marcus needed a moment to process it. Sofia working alongside David, two children with similar minds and challenges, creating art together in an environment that valued their differences rather than trying to eliminate them. The possibility seemed almost too perfect to be real, but James's expression suggested genuine interest rather than casual politeness. "Sofia would probably love that," Marcus said. "She's very talented artistically, and she's been isolated from other children her age due to our circumstances. But I should warn you that she can be shy initially, especially in new environments." James nodded understanding. "David is the same way." Perhaps that similarity would help them connect. "Would you be willing to bring her for a trial session this week?" The conversation concluded with arrangements for Sofia to join the following day's art session, a development that felt like another impossible piece of good fortune in a situation that had already exceeded Marcus's wildest hopes. As he drove home through Phoenix traffic, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 weeks. The eviction notice that had seemed like a disaster had forced him to take risks that led to opportunities he never would have discovered through conventional job searching. His criminal record, which had been an insurmountable barrier with most employers, had actually been seen as evidence of real-world experience by a family that valued authenticity over credentials. Most importantly, his experience as Sofia's father, which had often felt like a liability in professional settings, was being recognized as exactly the preparation he needed to help another child with similar challenges. The skills he developed out of necessity were proving valuable in ways he'd never anticipated. That evening, as he shared the day's developments with Sofia, her excitement was immediate and obvious. The prospect of meeting another child who experienced the world the way she did, of creating art in a proper studio with professional materials, of participating in the kind of educational opportunities she'd never had access to, lit up her face in ways Marcus hadn't seen since before their housing crisis began. Sofia's drawings that night incorporated new elements, architectural details that suggested she was imagining the space where she would soon be working, human figures that might represent the friend she was hoping to make. Her artistic expression had always reflected her emotional state, and the optimism in her recent work mirrored the hope that was growing in both of their hearts. As they prepared for sleep in their apartment, now secure thanks to Marcus's new income, both father and daughter felt the weight of transformation settling around them. The crisis that had threatened to destroy their small family had somehow led them to opportunities that addressed not just their immediate needs, but their deepest hopes for connection and purpose. Valley. Sofia pressed her face against the window, studying the landscape changes with the same intensity she brought to her artwork. The transition from their familiar urban environment to the manicured perfection of Paradise Valley was dramatic, each neighborhood representing increasing levels of wealth and privilege that she absorbed through visual observation rather than economic understanding. The Harrison Estates security gate impressed Sofia differently than it had Marcus. Where he saw barriers and reminders of class differences, she saw interesting architectural details and patterns in the metalwork that caught and reflected morning light. Her autism allowed her to notice design elements that others might overlook, transforming what could have been an intimidating entrance into a source of visual fascination. Marcus watched his daughter's reactions carefully as they approached the main house. Sofia's ability to adapt to new environments varied dramatically depending on factors that weren't always predictable. Sometimes change energized her, sparking creativity and engagement. Other times, unfamiliar spaces could trigger sensory overload that required hours of careful management to resolve. Catherine met them at the front entrance, her professional demeanor softened by genuine warmth as she greeted Sofia. The coordinator had clearly researched autism spectrum characteristics and understood the importance of creating calm, predictable initial impressions. Her voice remained quiet and steady, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sofia responded to Catherine's approach with cautious interest, rather than the anxiety Marcus had feared. She signed "Pretty House" in their shared sign language, her way of processing the visual complexity of the Harrison home's architecture and interior design. The high ceilings, natural lighting, and carefully curated art collections created an environment that stimulated rather than overwhelmed her aesthetic sensibilities. The walk to David's study gave Sofia time to adjust to the space while observing details that others might miss. She paused to examine a sculpture in the hallway, studying the way shadows created secondary patterns on its surface. Her interest in the interplay between light and form was something Marcus had noticed developing over the past year, a sophisticated understanding of visual relationships that suggested artistic potential beyond what her age might typically indicate. David was waiting in his study, surrounded by artwork that immediately captured Sofia's attention. The pieces displayed on walls and surfaces showed the same kind of intuitive understanding of composition and emotional expression that characterized her own drawings. She moved toward his work with the focused interest she usually reserved for museum visits, studying each piece with the intensity of someone recognizing a kindred creative spirit. The two children's first interaction occurred without words. Sofia approached the table where David was working and simply began drawing on a separate sheet of paper, creating geometric patterns that complemented the architectural elements he was sketching. David glanced at her work, then adjusted his own drawing to incorporate similar patterns, establishing a visual conversation that bypassed the verbal communication challenges both children sometimes experienced. Marcus watched this interaction with amazement and relief. Sofia's social difficulties had made friendships nearly impossible throughout her young life. Other children often found her communication style and intense interests difficult to understand or accept. But David seemed to recognize something familiar in her approach to creative expression, responding to her visual language in ways that suggested genuine connection rather than polite tolerance. The art session that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his work with either child individually. Sofia and David created collaborative pieces that incorporated both of their strengths, with Sofia contributing sophisticated color relationships and David adding precise geometric structures. Their work together produced results that neither could have achieved alone, a synergy that spoke to the power of connecting children who shared similar ways of processing and interpreting the world. Catherine observed the session from a distance, taking notes on her phone while maintaining the unobtrusive presence that both children seemed to prefer. Her background in coordinating services for high-profile families had taught her the importance of documentation without interference, recording progress and interactions that could inform future educational decisions. When James Harrison appeared unexpectedly during the session, both children looked up from their work with alert attention rather than the anxiety that adult intrusions often triggered. Sofia signed "Nice man" to Marcus, her assessment based on behavioral cues she'd learned to read accurately, despite having met James only briefly. David moved closer to his father with the comfortable familiarity of a child who felt genuinely understood and supported. "This is remarkable," James said quietly, studying the collaborative artwork the children had created. "I've never seen David work with another child this naturally. Usually, social interactions require extensive preparation and support." Marcus understood exactly what James meant. Sofia typically required careful preparation for any new social situation, with detailed discussions about expectations and potential challenges. Yet she'd connected with David immediately, their shared autism spectrum characteristics creating understanding that transcended the social barriers both children usually faced. The revelation that emerged during their conversation was both exciting and complex. James explained that David's educational team had been searching for peer interaction opportunities that could provide socialization within a framework that accommodated his autism spectrum needs. Traditional playgroups and classroom settings had proven overwhelming, but the structured creativity of art sessions seemed to provide exactly the right balance of engagement and predictability. Would Sofia be interested in joining David's educational program more regularly? James asked. "We could arrange for her to participate in art sessions 3 times per week, with compensation for her transportation and participation. It would benefit both children while providing her access to educational resources that might otherwise be unavailable." The offer represented opportunities that Marcus had never dared to imagine for Sofia. Professional art instruction, high-quality materials, and structured peer interaction within an environment designed to accommodate rather than challenge her autism spectrum characteristics. The financial compensation would also contribute to their household stability, though that seemed almost secondary to the educational and social benefits. Sofia's response to the proposal was immediate and enthusiastic. She signed, "Yes, please," repeatedly while bouncing slightly in her chair, a display of excitement that indicated how much the prospect appealed to her. Her drawings during the remainder of the session incorporated elements that suggested she was already imagining future collaborative projects with David. The logistics were arranged with the kind of efficiency that significant resources could provide. Transportation, scheduling, materials, and educational documentation were handled by Catherine and her team, removing barriers that might otherwise have made such an arrangement impossible for a family in Marcus's circumstances. By the end of the week, Sofia was attending regular sessions at the Harrison estate, while Marcus provided art instruction to both children. The dynamic was entirely different from his individual work with David. The children challenged each other creatively, Sofia's intuitive color sense, inspiring David to experiment with more expressive techniques, while his structural precision influenced her to develop more sophisticated compositional approaches. The educational benefits extended beyond artistic development. Both children showed improved verbal communication when working together, as if their shared creative focus provided a foundation for social interaction that felt safe and natural. David's tendency toward isolation decreased when Sofia was present, while her anxiety in new situations seemed to diminish when she had a peer who understood her communication style and interests. Marcus found his role evolving from individual instructor to facilitator of collaborative learning. His understanding of autism spectrum characteristics allowed him to recognize when the children needed support versus when they benefited from independent exploration. The skills he developed with Sofia translated perfectly to working with both children, creating an educational environment that maximized their strengths while accommodating their challenges. The weekly routine that developed around these sessions provided structure that benefited everyone involved. Sofia thrived on the predictability of regular art instruction, while David seemed more settled knowing that he had consistent peer interaction to anticipate. Marcus appreciated the professional validation that came from seeing his educational approach succeed with multiple children, confirming that his methods were broadly applicable rather than specific to his relationship with Sofia. James Harrison's involvement in the program grew gradually. Initially, he observed sessions from a distance, but as his confidence in Marcus's approach increased, he began participating more directly in discussions about David's progress and educational goals. These conversations revealed the complexity of raising a child with exceptional abilities alongside autism spectrum challenges, particularly when significant financial resources created both opportunities and complications. The Harrison family's wealth could provide David with access to the finest educational resources available, but money couldn't ensure that those resources would understand or accommodate his specific needs. Many expensive programs had failed because they approached autism as a deficit to be corrected, rather than a different way of experiencing and processing the world that could be supported and channeled productively. Marcus's approach, developed through necessity and love rather than formal training, emphasized meeting David where he was rather than trying to force him into conventional educational molds. The success of this method with both David and Sofia validated an educational philosophy that prioritized understanding and accommodation over correction and normalization. The breakthrough that changed everything occurred during a session focused on emotional expression through abstract art. Both children had been working on pieces that used color and form to represent different feelings. A therapeutic technique that Marcus had discovered helped Sofia process experiences that were difficult to verbalize. David had been struggling with a piece that was meant to represent frustration, his attempts becoming increasingly agitated as he worked to capture something that seemed to elude his usual precise control. Sofia watched his growing distress with the kind of focused attention she gave to problems that engaged her analytical mind. Without speaking, she moved to David's workspace and began adding elements to his composition. Her additions weren't corrections, but rather extensions that seemed to complete what he'd been trying to express. The colors she chose and the flowing lines she added transformed his angular, confined shapes into something that captured the feeling of frustration while also suggesting movement beyond it. David stared at the transformed artwork for several long moments before looking at Sofia with an expression of amazement and gratitude. "You know," he said simply, the first time Marcus had heard him use that phrase to acknowledge being understood by another person. Sofia smiled and signed "friends" in response, a declaration that carried profound significance for someone who had rarely experienced peer connection. The moment represented a breakthrough, not just in their artistic collaboration, but in their social and emotional development, proof that children with autism spectrum characteristics could form meaningful relationships when they found others who shared their way of experiencing the world. The incident led to expanded discussions about the therapeutic potential of the children's collaborative work. James consulted with developmental specialists who confirmed that peer relationships based on shared interests and compatible communication styles could provide social and emotional benefits that adult instruction couldn't replicate. The decision was made to formalize Sofia's participation in David's educational program, creating a structured peer learning environment that would benefit both children while providing Marcus with expanded professional responsibilities. The arrangement represented a new model for autism education, one that prioritized social connection and collaborative learning over individual instruction and behavioral modification. Catherine worked with Marcus to develop documentation systems that would track both children's progress while maintaining the flexibility and responsiveness that made their collaborative work so successful. The balance between structure and spontaneity proved crucial, providing enough predictability to support the children's needs while preserving the organic creativity that drove their most significant breakthroughs. The expanded program also created opportunities for Marcus to develop his professional skills through consultation with specialists and access to educational resources that would have been impossible to afford independently. James arranged for him to work with art therapists, child development experts, and autism specialists, building his knowledge base while validating the intuitive approaches he'd developed through his experience with Sofia. Sofia's transformation within this environment was remarkable. The confident, creative child she'd always been in private began emerging in social situations, her artistic abilities providing a foundation for peer interaction that felt natural rather than forced. Her communication skills improved dramatically, both verbal and nonverbal, as she found safe ways to express herself within the collaborative learning framework. David's progress was equally significant. His tendency toward isolation decreased as his friendship with Sofia developed, while his artistic expression became more emotionally rich and complex. The precision and structure that characterized his autism spectrum thinking, rather than being seen as limitations, became strengths that contributed to increasingly sophisticated creative work. The success of their collaborative program began attracting attention from other families dealing with similar challenges. Word of the innovative approach spread through networks of parents seeking educational alternatives for children with autism spectrum characteristics, leading to inquiries about expanding the model to include additional participants. James and Marcus spent increasing amounts of time discussing the potential for creating a broader program that could serve more families while maintaining the individual attention and peer collaboration that made their current approach so successful. The conversations were complex, involving considerations of space, staffing, philosophy, and the kind of careful screening that would ensure new participants could benefit from and contribute to the collaborative learning environment. The financial aspects of expansion were challenging, despite James's significant resources. Creating a program that could serve families across economic levels while maintaining high-quality instruction and appropriate support services required sustainable funding models that went beyond individual tuition payments. Marcus found himself involved in discussions about program development, teacher training, and educational philosophy that stretched his background and challenged him to articulate approaches that had developed intuitively through his work with Sofia. The process of formalizing his methods required deep reflection on what made his approach effective and how those elements could be replicated by other instructors. Sofia's involvement in these planning discussions was remarkable for someone her age. Her insights about what made learning environments comfortable and productive for children with autism proved invaluable in designing spaces and approaches that would accommodate different sensory needs and communication styles. Her artistic abilities also contributed to visualizing program concepts and creating materials that would support other children's learning. The collaborative relationship between Marcus and James evolved beyond employer and employee into something more like partners in a shared mission. Their different backgrounds and resources complemented each other in ways that neither could have achieved alone, creating possibilities for innovation and impact that extended far beyond their original arrangement. The weekly art sessions continued to serve as the foundation for all their other activities, the core experience that demonstrated the power of peer collaboration for children with autism spectrum characteristics. Each session provided new insights into how creative expression could serve as both a learning tool and a communication bridge, supporting development in ways that traditional educational approaches often missed. Marcus's relationship with Sofia deepened as he watched her flourish in the collaborative learning environment they'd helped create. Her confidence and social skills developed dramatically as she found her place within a peer relationship that valued her unique perspectives and abilities. The isolation that had characterized much of her early childhood was replaced by genuine friendship and creative partnership. The transformation extended beyond the children to include their families. Marcus's financial security allowed him to focus on Sofia's development and education rather than simple survival, while James found his understanding of autism spectrum characteristics deepened through exposure to Marcus's experiential knowledge and Sofia's different but complementary presentation of autism traits. The documentation of both children's progress provided evidence for the effectiveness of their collaborative approach that interested researchers and educators beyond their immediate community. The combination of quantitative measures and qualitative observations suggested that peer-based learning within structured creative environments could address social, emotional, and academic development simultaneously. As autumn progressed toward winter, the program that had begun as individual art instruction for David had evolved into something unprecedented. A collaborative learning environment where children with autism spectrum characteristics could develop their abilities while forming meaningful peer relationships, supported by adults who understood their unique needs and celebrated their different ways of experiencing the world. The success of Sofia and David's partnership became the foundation for imagining broader possibilities for autism education, approaches that prioritized connection and collaboration over isolation and remediation. Their friendship demonstrated that children with autism spectrum characteristics could form rich, supportive relationships when given opportunities to connect through shared interests and compatible communication styles. The art room at the Harrison estate had become more than an educational space. It was a laboratory for developing new approaches to autism support, a demonstration site for alternative educational philosophies, and most importantly, a place where two children who might otherwise have remained isolated had found each other and discovered the power of collaborative creativity. Marcus watched Sofia and David work together during their sessions and saw not just the success of their specific program but the potential for transforming how society understood and supported children with autism spectrum characteristics. Their collaboration suggested possibilities for inclusion and accommodation that went far beyond traditional special education models. The documentation process revealed patterns and techniques that could be replicated in other settings with appropriate training and support. The emphasis on peer collaboration, creative expression, and accommodation rather than remediation provided a framework that honored autism spectrum differences while promoting development and connection. The winter months brought new challenges and opportunities to test the resilience and adaptability of their collaborative program. Seasonal changes affected both children differently, requiring adjustments to their routines and environments that provided learning opportunities about flexibility and problem-solving within supportive relationships. Sofia's response to program expansion discussions showed her growing confidence and leadership abilities. Her insights about what would help other children like herself demonstrated sophisticated understanding of autism spectrum needs and remarkable empathy for peers she hadn't yet met. Her evolution from an isolated child struggling with basic needs to a confident collaborator helping to design educational programs for others represented transformation that extended far beyond individual achievement. David's development followed a parallel but different trajectory. His friendship with Sofia had provided the social foundation that allowed his other abilities to flourish in ways that previous educational attempts had failed to achieve. His artistic work became more emotionally expressive while maintaining the precision and structure that characterized his autism spectrum strengths. The collaboration between Marcus and James evolved into genuine partnership as they worked together to formalize and expand their educational approach. Their different backgrounds and perspectives created a comprehensive framework that addressed both practical implementation and theoretical foundation, combining experiential knowledge with resource access in ways that neither could have accomplished independently. The program's success attracted attention from autism advocacy organizations, educational researchers, and families seeking alternatives to traditional special education approaches. The inquiries and site visits provided opportunities to share their methods while learning from other innovative programs and approaches. The art therapy component of their work proved particularly valuable in helping both children process and express experiences that were difficult to verbalize. The combination of individual expression and collaborative creation provided multiple pathways for communication and emotional development that accommodated different autism spectrum presentation styles. As winter deepened, the warm, well-lit art room became an even more important refuge for both children. The consistent environment and predictable routines provided stability that supported their continued growth and development during a season that could be challenging for people with sensory sensitivities. The friendship between Sofia and David continued to deepen, providing both children with their first experience of peer relationships based on genuine understanding and shared interests, rather than adult facilitation or therapeutic intervention. Their natural compatibility demonstrated that autism spectrum characteristics could facilitate rather than hinder social connection when children found others with compatible communication styles and interests. Marcus's professional development accelerated as he worked to articulate and formalize educational approaches that had developed intuitively through his relationship with Sofia. The process of explaining his methods to other professionals required deep analysis of what made his approach effective and how those elements could be taught to other educators. The expansion planning process revealed the complexity of creating sustainable programs that could serve diverse populations while maintaining the individual attention and peer collaboration that made their current approach so successful. The balance between structure and flexibility, group dynamics and individual needs, required careful consideration and creative problem-solving. Sofia's artistic development flourished within the collaborative environment, her work becoming more sophisticated and emotionally complex as she found safe ways to express her inner experiences. Her pieces began incorporating elements that suggested narrative and emotional depth beyond what her age might typically indicate. David's artistic evolution paralleled his social development, his work becoming more expressive and communicative as his friendship with Sofia provided emotional safety and creative inspiration. The precision that characterized his autism spectrum thinking enhanced rather than constrained his artistic expression when channeled through supportive collaboration. The therapeutic benefits of their collaborative work extended beyond the art sessions themselves, influencing both children's behavior and development in other areas of their lives. The confidence and communication skills they developed through creative partnership transferred to other situations and relationships. The program documentation revealed measurable improvements in social interaction, emotional regulation, and creative expression for both children, providing evidence for the effectiveness of peer-based collaborative learning approaches. The combination of quantitative assessments and qualitative observations created a comprehensive picture of development and progress. As they prepared for the next phase of program development and potential expansion, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his and Sofia's lives had changed since that desperate day when he'd responded to an unusual job listing. The transformation extended far beyond financial security to include professional purpose, meaningful relationships, and the satisfaction of contributing to innovations that could benefit many other families. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the National Institute of Mental Health wanted to document Sofia and David's collaborative program for autism research. The attention was flattering but concerning. James Harrison surprised Marcus by prioritizing the children's privacy over publicity. His home office revealed maps of potential program sites and financial projections, showing his commitment to expanding their educational model nationwide. Sofia's reaction showed remarkable maturity. She expressed excitement about helping other children while worrying about maintaining her friendship with David. Her emotional intelligence had grown dramatically since their desperate days facing eviction. The pilot expansion launched with 3 carefully selected children. Marcus found himself training additional instructors, articulating techniques that had developed intuitively through his work with Sofia. The new art studio in the guest house represented state-of-the-art autism-friendly design. Research documentation provided objective evidence for their success. Standardized assessments showed significant improvements in social communication and emotional regulation for all participants, validating their approach with scientific rigor. Media attention followed, bringing opportunities and challenges. Universities invited Marcus to speak about experiential autism support, while his expertise influenced educational policy at state and national levels. The breakthrough came when nonverbal participant Alex created his first collaborative piece with Sofia and David. The artwork demonstrated multiplicative rather than additive effects of their peer collaboration. Sofia's transformation from isolated child to confident leader validated Marcus's belief that different didn't mean deficient. Her journey challenged conventional assumptions about autism capabilities and communication potential. James established a foundation ensuring long-term sustainability. The program's influence extended beyond direct service to include policy advocacy for systemic change in autism education approaches. 3 years later, the program operated in multiple states with federal recognition and funding. Sofia had become an articulate advocate, while David successfully transitioned to mainstream education with continued peer support. Marcus's expertise led to consulting opportunities with schools seeking inclusive environments. The collaborative model influenced special education legislation, prioritizing accommodation over normalization. The art therapy research revealed neurological changes correlating with behavioral improvements. Brain imaging showed increased connectivity in areas associated with social communication and emotional regulation. Sofia's artistic exhibitions raised awareness about autism capabilities while fundraising for expansion. Her artwork became a vehicle for advocacy, expressing her unique perspective and creative vision. The program's cost-effectiveness analysis demonstrated superior outcomes per dollar compared to conventional interventions. The efficiency supported policy arguments for reallocating special education resources. International collaboration brought cross-cultural perspectives, while validating universal principles of respectful, strength-based intervention. The model adapted successfully across diverse communities and contexts. James's corporate advocacy for neurodiversity created employment opportunities while challenging workplace culture. His personal transformation affected business practices and philanthropic priorities. The Foundation's annual conference brought together stakeholders to coordinate systemic change efforts. Published research influenced professional training programs and clinical practice guidelines. Marcus's family stability allowed professional development while maintaining commitment to Sofia's success. Their shared advocacy work demonstrated possibilities that seemed impossible during their housing crisis. Adult transition programming extended collaborative principles to workplace training and community integration. The approach proved effective across developmental stages and life transitions. Sofia's preparation for independence included continued artistic development and advocacy training. Her evolution demonstrated long-term program effectiveness while inspiring newer participants and families. Longitudinal studies tracked participants into adulthood, revealing lasting benefits that extended far beyond immediate educational outcomes. The relationships formed proved durable and mutually beneficial. the collaborative art program had evolved from desperate employment solution to movement for systemic autism education reform, validating beliefs about human potential and community responsibility. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.